My name is Lena Donaldson. I am the Assistant Director for Events and Programs at the University of Maryland Alumni Association. Welcome to day 3 of the EnTERPreneur Conference. Thank you for joining us for Cultural Competency, Setting the Foundation for Businesses. We have an expert panel of Terps with us today to lead us in a discussion on the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and how you can set the foundation for cultural competency in your business. Just a few housekeeping tips. We'd like to make sure that everyone remains on mute while we have the panel going on. We don't want to disturb our panelists, and we want to make sure that all of our fellow alumni can hear. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You do not have to wait for us to prompt you. We will get to those questions without a doubt. To get our session started today, I'd like for all of the panelists to introduce themselves. We're going to start with Dr. Van Bailey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Van Bailey. I use he, him, his, and they, them, theirs pronouns. I am the Director for Bias Incident Support Services here at University of Maryland. I've had previous experience starting 2 LGBTQ centers, one at Harvard and the other one at the University of Miami. And I've been in higher education for about 15 years now in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Next, Amy Wilson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me for this great conversation. This concept is very near and dear to my heart because I'm the CEO and founder of Empathy for Change. And I also authored a book by the same name that came out earlier this year. And I graduated in 2004 from the University of Maryland. I was in the first class of global communities in I forgot what place it was, but and I was an RA in the International House. So early on, I learned about the importance of global competency and working with each other across lines and whatever that may be. And also when I grew up, I was in a homogeneously white area. And so this program helps me expand my worldview. And so in the past, I'll just tell you like very high level, in the book, I explore my side of being an empath and a highly sensitive person, but also an idea of a change maker. So I think of myself as a public entrepreneur. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, I joined AmeriCorps as a team leader and designed a rebuilding project to build 50 homes in 4 months when I was down there. In 2010, I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, and I eventually led this initiative called Building a Culture of Innovation. And a lot of this cultural competency we talk about is in there, and the work that we were trying to build and redesign a 100-year-old company. And in 2015, I joined the Obama administration as a Presidential Innovation Fellow and Entrepreneur in Residence for them. And then 2020, I was an Aspen Tech Policy Fellow, and I was in San Francisco trying to work in policy entrepreneurships because the people who shape the policy shape the world. So, and then at the end of the day, I'm here. I published my book in the past year, and it is, and I've been on my book tour and talking with you fine fellows and people. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And now Dave and Dara Feldman.
Hi, everybody. Go Terps. My name is Dara Feldman, class of 1984, pronouns she, her, hers. And Dave and I both live on the unceded land of the Piscataways. And so super grateful to be in Circle Square with you all, humbled to be part of this really important panel. And just to anchor why this is meaningful for me, I've been an educator for 38 years and have come to understand my own unearned white privilege and being really aware of some of the harm that I unintentionally caused to many of my students. And then having had the honor of doing work around the world in about 13 different countries, and knowing that relationships matter, and that really being anchored in the other person and what's important to them. And so I'm humbled to be here and grateful to learn with everybody. Honey?
So I am Dave. I'm also class of 84 and class of 91. I've got an MBA from Maryland as well. And I'm the other half of the, you like to say, the wife-husband team. I know my place in this partnership. Our organization is called Virtues Matter, and we help people cultivate virtues. And we'll talk a little bit about empathy, honesty, dignity, nobility. We help work with personal individuals and organizations in both their own personal growth and team building. I'm a lifelong resident of Maryland. Actually a co-founder of Bethesda Green. So I've done a lot of work in sustainability and a lot of community work locally. And now we're, just helping to work with others who are trying to make the world a better place. I know that sounds grand and lofty, but that's really our kind of underlying goal. So pleasure to be here with everyone.
Thank you so much. I'd like to get this session started by asking each of you, why is cultural competency necessary for employee and company success?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and just, jumping right into it with, kind of complete honesty and transparency in the statement that people bring their whole selves to the work and to jobs, and to ask people to not is just unrealistic. They underperform, and trauma then can happen. Another aspect of my identity is that I'm an MSW student, and so thinking about trauma and how trauma shows up in the workplace is something that I'm highly interested in and something that I've studied. And in full transparency as well, I have left companies and organizations because I have not been able to be seen or understood, or even my identity is taken into consideration. So a very quick story, I was being recruited by an organization who was highly interested in the fact that I am a transgender individual. I was doing transgender advocacy in the area that I was in. I was sitting on boards for LGBTQ+ organizations. And, one of the first questions that I asked them is, does your company have insurance that will, that it's trans accommodating? The company did not know. And for me, that was a very simple answer and a complicated one, in which I said, well, I can't work there. Regardless of if you all have it or not, the fact that you're interested in recruiting me, and you don't even know if your company has the insurance is trans accommodating, tells me enough. As a trans individual, I cannot live in certain states because I do not have certain protections. And so I am automatically looking at companies who have non-discrimination statements, who have insurance policies that allow for trans individuals to thrive there. And so, that is something that I'm looking for. And I know that other trans individuals, dress codes, things like that other trans individuals might be looking for. And another very quick story is I was working at, I will say, a highly elite private university. And, one of the things that I brought with me was the saddlebag that was gifted to me from one of the queer elders in our community. I was a big fan of a show called A Different World. One of the main characters on there, Dwayne Wade, has a saddlebag that he would take into the classroom. I told myself when I got my doctorate and whenever my job was out of that I was going to get a saddlebag, and it was gifted to me by a trans elder. So I was on campus wearing the saddlebag, and I went to go take my staff picture. Well, I took the staff picture, and then the day after, my supervisor brought me a laptop bag with the, that university's emblem and all of that, and said, we just wanted to give you a welcome gift. And I said, no, what is this really about? And she said, the president and the dean saw that bag and they just don't like it. They think that it's unbecoming of somebody who is of this institution. And for me, it was just such an interesting moment for me because I felt erased in that moment. I felt like my, connection, particularly around my queerness and connection around culture as a Black person, was not being taken into consideration. And for me, fashion is very political and how we are able to show up in workspaces. And so, being the literal erasure of somebody telling me that, we're going to take away this bag from you and give you this company bag. So when you're in pictures, you are becoming of this institution, to me was just an inkling for me to get a clue of how I was going to be treated in this company. And yeah, I left, after a very, hard 4 years of being there, and constant struggles of not being seen, and not being understood in my identities. And the last thing I will say is that, when we do allow for people to show up as their whole selves, they perform better and they can inform, what kind of change can happen within the company, right? As a transgender man, I know firsthand, because of my gender journey, what sexism looks like, right? And because that has been in my experience as being seen as a woman, and now that I am seen as a man, I know firsthand that sexism exists because my voice has been elevated in spaces now that I have a beard. And now that people see me very differently. I have, seen how men talk over women in spaces. I have seen, how women have been pushed out of spaces and not understood, in terms of the strengths that they bring to spaces. And so when we allow for these conversations to happen and people being able to bring their whole selves, we begin to have conversations of, those real conversations that allow us to connect to one another and allow us to break down systems that get in the way of progress. And so, I'll leave those couple of stories with you all, and something to think about as it relates to people bringing their whole selves when it comes to this work.
Thank you. Amy, you want to go next?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for sharing those stories, Van. It's so powerful to hear firsthand accounts like that. So thanks for sharing that. And I completely agree. It's important to be able to share your whole self at work. And a lot of these stories have bubbled up in the research and the conversations that I had in writing my book. And something that I think I want to bring first and foremost is a quote that I got from Antoinette Carroll. She is leading an effort called the Creative Reaction Lab in St. Louis, Missouri. And she created this amazing equity-centered community design process where it essentially looks at the systems, it looks at a lot of the things that are shaping our reality. And empathy is central to her work, empathy and humility. As I was going through this to learn more about how do we create more empathy in the world, she said this quote, which I love, and I put first in front of a lot of the conversations that I have. And number one, she says, the lack of empathy creates harm, creates trauma, and creates negative systemic impact. And then she says, but an abundance of empathy creates safety, creates confidence, creates power, and creates systemic impact. And that is so powerful because to me, it just speaks to the importance of just helping to understand someone else and to feel their emotions, to see them as a whole person. And one thing I want to mention because of the story that you just shared, Van, just yesterday I posted about this. And in this research the work that I do and in trying to build more empathy in organizations and companies, I just posted this story yesterday. So I'm just going to bring that post up. So yesterday it was there was an announcement about Chick-fil-A their profits are being used to push anti-trans state laws and kill the Equality Act. And as a person who is LGBT myself, this is something that I've had a conflicted relationship with Chick-fil-A, and I do not eat there. But what was interesting is in the grand scheme of things, as I was, starting up my company, Chick-fil-A reached out to me to help talk about their plans to create a culture of empathy within their organization. So I was like, okay, I'll listen to what they have to say and see maybe they're turning a new leaf. And they were asking for advice for an upcoming conference where they're saying and they were also offering to feature my book that was being set around the entire company. So that would be like, great for me to get that exposure. But in that meeting, I directly asked them about their historical anti-LGBT stance and funding of organizations and actionable changes that they're making to combat these injustices that they're creating. So at the end of the day, I told them that they will never be able to create a culture of empathy until everyone at that company and the people who come there knows they can show up as their true, authentic selves without fear of judgment. And like they went on to say, we do this LGBT thing over here in Utah, and then they also said we had this truth where we're a Christian organization still. And so they even said they were stopping donating to them and turning a new leaf. So obviously after that happened, I was like, I don't think they're going to be changing much. But that's what's at stake here, is that they're like, as this news came out, yesterday, as I was posting, was being like, what, this is what's happening, is that if you're actually funding and like, this is a new level of kind of funding hate and like blocking the Equality Act, like that, and that's like with money that is being funneled in different ways. They're just doing it under the radar. And we see this in so many different companies and so many different organizations that, like, if they're not funneling money to areas that they really care deeply about because of their Christian values, that they might, there's lots of microaggressions, there's lots of things that happen, and we're all kind of a factor, that's been a factor of our lives, to be in those situations where we have been built up in a capitalistic society that honors white experience. And so we have to be very aware of that and show that up in the world as we go forward. So that's just like a quick story that I want to share about like what's at stake here. And then at the end of the day, the pathway, I think, to helping with cultural competence is to do it through empathy. And empathy allows you to have compassion for yourself, and also builds connection with others as you start thinking about, as you go about life. And then also you're processing intense emotions, managing stress, and mitigating bias. So you have to start understanding that. And then it's also, empathy is important in sensing what other people need. And also when you're collaborating with other people, which you do in so many different ways, it's so important to understand, we're doing this in business, you need to understand what do people need and want in the moment. And then also in a bigger way in society, we need this community care that comes up. And so it helps us leaders to be more effective and to motivate others. But also at the same time, it makes people feel heard. So for those reasons and many others, empathy builds better teams and communities at the end of the day. So that's, I'm a big proponent. Obviously, I wrote a book about it, but I think everybody else on the panel here would agree that empathy is at the center of what we're trying to do here. So.
Thank you, Amy. Dave and Dara.
Thank you, Van and Amy, really for your beautiful thoughts and helping to get at the heart of the matter. Right? We all want to be seen, heard, valued, honored, and appreciated. So just want to invite everybody to just Tap into your head, your heart, whichever part is stronger for you. And think about a time when you felt misunderstood, right? Where people didn't get you, right? They were not honoring. And just everybody, like, thumbs up if you've ever had that experience. Could even just be with a family member, right? So we've all had that experience. And thank you, Jacob, for giving us that little thumb electronically. And Sammy as well. Okay, see, this is empathy right now. Thank you all. And actually having compassion, because compassion is having empathy and then going into action. So anyways, I digress. So when we don't feel understood, right, and we're in our feelings, then we're actually stuck in our amygdala, right, in the reptile part of our brain. And we're not able to access our prefrontal cortex and be able to thoughtfully reason. So what can happen is we can also experience shame. We can withdraw, we can attack others, we can avoid, or we can attack ourselves. And when we're in that mode, we're not really able to bring our best selves forward, whether it's personally in personal relationships or in business. And so if we're leaders of a company and we're not aware of how others might be feeling, we're leading from a place of just authority and not from a more restorative place, working with people instead of doing things to or for people. That's about control and compliance. And how people under your leadership might feel is not heard, not valued, not appreciated. And they're not going to bring their best selves there. So as leaders, we need to do our work to create spaces for understanding. And so really, it's not about calling Dr. Google and learning everything there is to learn about different cultures, different identities. It's more about creating those conditions and those spaces so that all voices are heard. And so I'm just going to keep it simple at that. And then one last piece, why cultural competency is necessary is the world is flat. We are one world, one humanity, right? And now we may be working with or being of service to people from all over the world, or even in the next house next door that has, different values perhaps than what we have. And we still need to be honoring and respectful of them. So how do we do it? We start by building relationships, true, authentic, meaningful relationships. Just science, right? The science of biology and who we are and that connection. Maybe how about for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I kind of trying to tie together what everybody had said. You were talking about leadership right now, and Amy was talking about her experience with Chick-fil-A, for example. So you know what? Organizations, whether you're a business, whether you're a hospital or not, you have to realize that demographics are changing right now. I mean, we are going into a very different world where, I think it was just announced Maryland and Georgia are moving to a non-white majority. I think it's this year as of this census. And the markets or the individuals are asking for a different kind of a workplace as well. Van was saying, I don't want to be in a place where my rights, my views, I'm just not respected in certain ways. So organizations are going to have real issues with attracting talent, retaining talent, and keeping a positive workplace if they don't adjust and adapt to the new realities. And, Dara has mentioned our age, and it's interesting. We grew up in a time that a lot of these kinds of conversations didn't take place. People weren't good or bad. It just didn't happen. But there's a level of awareness that's growing right now across a lot of organizations, and the expectations are starting to change as a result of that as well. And I think a lot of it is being driven by millennials, and a different culture right now. They grew up in a very different world, and they expect a different kind of a culture and a community that's actually being created. And people will leave. or people will not be happy. They will not be productive. For those of you who are business owners out there and you want a good bottom line, you know what? If you don't have people who are happy in your organization, they're not going to produce well. They're not going to play nice with others. They're not going to be really conformist. So it's really up to organizations to understand that. And you know, I think if you're an organization owner, it's not just within your organization as well. You're going to get that pressures from your customers. You're going to get that from your suppliers, your partners, and so forth. So the world is changing. I look at it as a competitive opportunity to get ahead and really start to say, okay, I don't understand these. As I just said, I didn't know a lot of these things growing up, but you know what? It's up to me to learn, to listen. We talked a little bit about empathy. You know, even though you don't know, I know that I don't know, so I ask questions. And when I'm in a place with somebody, you know, in a respectful way, I ask and I understand, you know, where are you from? You know, I actually was thinking about this earlier, and one of my favorite people is Anthony Bourdain. And he just did an amazing job of going to different places and connecting with people and putting all politics aside, all differences aside, everybody connected in some ways. So there are ways of introducing culture and bringing people together in different ways. So I think that's kind of why cultural competency is necessary from that level.
Absolutely. And baby, just to piggyback, I'm sorry, thank you for your patience. Connection before content, connection before correction, and being mindful and persistent to stay engaged. Our daughter goes by the pronouns of they, them, theirs, and they have been our daughter for 30 years. 2 years ago, they elevated this request to us. And talk about having to really be mindful. And I've effed up, right? I mean, I've called her she. And my son would jump in as an ally. And I still sometimes forget. And it's my responsibility because I love her. I've made the commitment to use their pronouns. And as entrepreneurs and leaders, it's our responsibility to make the commitment to humbly learn.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that will probably resonate with a lot of our alumni on campus and off. I want to pose the question now about what types of work environments do we want to create that can hold and honor all of our identities?
Yeah, I think it's such an important, you know, aspect to be able to walk into your place of work. We're likely, you know, pre-pandemic, when we were, you know, showing up to offices, we're spending, you know, and even for us who are working remotely, spending the majority of our time in these places, should be able to feel like you can thrive in all of your identities. That's just, you know, kind of facts. You know, so for me, one of the biggest things is first being able to understand the difference between cultural competency and cultural humility. I think the Feldmans just really talked about it in some practical ways very well. You know, cultural competency is great, right? But that's really about awareness, understanding that there are different identities. And I would say that that's layer one, right? Like that is the entry point that, yes, I am working with people who are different than me. And I should have an awareness that there are people who are not like me at my job. But the next step is cultural humility, right? And I think being able to be seen in all of our identities and being able to thrive in all of our identities requires us to exercise a certain level of humility in which we don't know it all. We're always in the constant practice of curiosity, right? So with cultural humility, there are three aspects around committing to, you know, lifelong self-critique, you know, being able to challenge power imbalances that you see, and that listening to that internal voice inside of you, right? Your body gives you lots of information. So if something is making you uncomfortable, that is likely a good level of information for you to move into action. And then having affiliation and allyship with organization and groups and people when it comes to advocacy. And so, you know, it's being able to be an ally or an accomplice in spaces is about action. Right? It's not just an identity that you get to, either put a sticker up or say that you are because you have goodwill and a good heart, but it's actually what are you doing in action to allow groups to feel like they can thrive within your organization. And I also believe that asking the really hard questions around who's here, who's not here, and why they aren't here, I think is a really important exercise that people can go through, right? When you're looking at not just diversity in numbers, but looking around the people who you're recruiting, and you begin to ask yourselves, who are our most burdened people within the company, right? And then beginning to ask those people, what do we need to do for change? Because when you work from centering your most burdened folks, your most vulnerable people within the company, everybody wins, everybody can thrive. I was working on a contract with a government agency, and they were trying to figure out, how to be inclusive and thinking about social justice during COVID-19. And I asked them, about the staff members who, are required no matter what to show up to work, right? What about those folks who are wage employees? What about those folks who are your custodians, your janitorial staff, the people that are service in more service aspects and who are not in the C-suite, right? And thinking about the folks who are oftentimes ignored when we are thinking about creating policies. Ask them what they need, and I bet you whatever they come up with will benefit everybody. I think that, the pandemic has given us a lot of clarity around just what exactly disability rights justice folks have been saying around opening up remote work, right? Was something necessary for people who have disabilities, and they've been saying that for years. But soon as capitalism became compromised, we figured it out. Right. So I want us to, be in a place that we're not consistently reactive, but being proactive and asking those hard questions. And those hard questions might question leadership. Those hard questions might cause your leadership to change their structure. Those hard questions might actually require you to funnel more money and resources to vulnerable populations and groups. And that's okay. And so, change is necessary. And change is hard, but I do believe when we ask ourselves these hard questions and we center our most burdened and vulnerable people, we all will win.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Agree with so many different aspects of what you were just saying, Van, Dr. Bailey. I was, when I think about cultural competence, I was actually just starting to think about, I was like, I think you need to go to definition. Like, what is the definition of cultural competence? And then see if we're meeting it, right? Like, I'm very practical in that respect. So when I looked it up, it said that there was 4 components of cultural competence. The first one is awareness, which you mentioned, Dr. Bailey. It's awareness of one's own cultural worldview, right? Number 2 is attitude towards cultural differences. So, how do you feel about people who are different than you? 3 is knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. And 4 is cross-cultural skills. So it's awareness, attitudes, knowledge, and skills. So all 4 of those things are important for cultural competency. And so I just wanted to think about that. And when we bring it into the work context, cultural competence requires that organizations have a defined set of values and principles, and also demonstrate behaviors, attitudes, policies, and structures that enable people to work effectively with whatever cultures exist there. But so I think in a bigger way, the organization has to have an awareness, has to have knowledge, has to have and figure out what their attitude is. And, it should be, an attitude of acceptance, of You were saying, Dr. Bailey, this idea of curiosity, humility about other groups of people. So I think about that in a deeper way, and bringing it back to the concept of empathy. Like when I think about the simplest definition of empathy that I've found and I usually work with is empathy is feeling with someone rather than for them. And I break it down into 3 elements, which in the front of my book, I have a head, a heart, and a hand. That is central to this work. There's 3 kinds of empathy. There's the head, which is cognitive empathy. So it's a skill, building our life as a skill, and this idea of empathy and humility and curiosity, but it's also a choice that we make. So that's really important when we think about the greater scheme of things, is that we make a choice every day to add cultural competency or empathy. Number 2 is emotional. So feeling our feelings in relation to another. So understanding how we feel, how we react in different circumstances. And then the third piece, which is compassionate empathy, is where you move from kind of yourself into working with other people. I think that's the hand, right? That's the action aspect of it. You can understand what others need from you and you're sensing it from them, but you're willing to help if needed. So when I think about bigger ideas of change, and I've been the director of innovation for a decade in different large organizations, the federal government, working in innovation.gov. I really have summarized it into being like, this is such a buzzword. Can we talk about what it really means? And to me, it means empathy plus action. And can we come together and like, we might have compassion for somebody, but can we act upon it in the way that somebody else needs? So in the end of the day, by and large, the world around us has been designed for us. Instead of being designed with us, it's designed for us. So the way to get out of that is to flip the script to design with and not for. And so, I mentioned Antoinette Carroll earlier. She says this, that systems of oppression have been designed. So we have a responsibility to redesign them with empathy, with humility, and equity at the center of what we do. And so what does that look like? That means another person I talked about at Plus Peace and the Activate Labs, she does peace building within refugee communities. She mentioned that empathy has hands and feet. It means you're moving yourself, your body, and your work to the spaces where problems are occurring. And Dr. Bailey, you were mentioning how, I was writing down this note, centering around the most vulnerable populations. That's where we should be moving ourselves, right? And at the end of the day, the same person, Monica, says, if something is working for somebody, they're not going to change it. And they will keep the status quo because they personally benefit from the way things are. And I come from consulting. I come from a world of like management consulting, where I was trying to redesign this company, and also the federal government, where I'm trying to redesign for innovation and empathy. And those are everywhere. You can see that being showing up. So what I designed in my book was a framework that I designed when I was in these spaces, called the heart, the head, the hand framework, that helps us redesign those systems, right? Think about in the heart way is like, what is our purpose? What are the people? Who are the people, and who's there, right? How do we center ourselves around those individuals? The hand, which is the principles and values of what we value, and the policies that shape the world. And then third is the hand, which is practices and process. What is the process we're doing to get there? And then at the end of the day, if we can use this, and I have a whole canvas associated with it, if you can use it, then you can be able to look at the system and say, how are we designing the system, and how are we continually improving the system, instead of just saying it's the way it is, it's command and control, the power's at the top, everybody shares, everybody just follows along with the top. It's instead having this new power dynamic where it's open, it's participatory, and it's peer driven. So those are just some thoughts that I've got from the research that I've done in the book. So hopefully you can learn some more about it. And if you want to go to my website, it's amyjwilson.com/resources. I have that framework and my Canvas on there for free for everybody to join, to download, and you can use that to redesign your own systems.
Thank you. So thank you, both of you. Dr. Bailey, thank you for elevating that there's wisdom in everyone, and that we need to be thinking about who's not at the table, making sure their voices are heard, and that it's strength-based and asset-driven, especially from those voices who are not normally represented. And then also, Amy, thank you for, elevating just the definition of what cultural competency is and all of the different resources that you have outlined in your book. And for us, I think instead of just sharing, we'd like to offer an experience and then bring you back to 5 strategies that we have experienced our own and now share with others around the world to help us really create the kind of workplace that we want to create, but it's also could be your home place, right? It can be used personally, professionally, organizationally. It's really transformative. And we like to start with doing something called a virtues pick. And so, Dave, if you would pull up the empathy card on the reflections card from our Virtues Cards app. And what we'll do is I'll invite Dave just to read the front. And I'd like to invite everybody here that's listening, think about how empathy resonates for you. And if you want to either type it in the chat box, or if you have the courage to unmute and very, very briefly share how empathy relates to you in relationship to this topic that we're talking about with regard to cultural competence. And I'll have Dave read the front of the card and then just model really quickly.
Yeah, and before I read the card, I want to just say, I've been taking notes of all the different speakers of talking about this, and our work, our organization is called Virtues Matter, and virtues is kind of underlying a lot of what relationships are about in the workplace. It's really about creating a place that works for the individual and the organization. And I've heard humility, empathy, compassion, dignity, curiosity, commitment. So there's a lot of these different kinds of things that really play into that. And one of the points that I wanted to bring, but then I'll read the card, is what Dr. Bailey was saying before, is it starts with understanding what those look like and then moving them to action. So it's taking those and cultivating those. And strangely enough, those things that I mentioned, things like humility, you might know what it is, but how do you practice it? And those things are things that need to be cultivated. And there are opportunities to apply those in different situations and develop those in different skills. So Dara's, I guess you took the thing from me, so you'll read her.
Well, and actually, baby, why don't we like to do this. We like to riff on each other. This is
our
our normal, talk about workplace cultural competence, teach what you need to learn. Okay, thank you for your patience. So our framework comes from the Virtues Project, which is a global grassroots organization in over 140 countries, honored by the United Nations and endorsed by the Dalai Lama. It's changed our lives personally and professionally. I'm just going to briefly share the 5 strategies, and then we'll go to the empathy card. So the first strategy is speaking the language of virtues. It's about acknowledging people for the good that we see in them, and then also guiding them and correcting them, bringing them back to their highest selves. So one of the questions that we do when we're building community is we think about what are our strength virtues and what are growth virtues. The second strategy is recognizing teachable moments. So instead of shaming and blaming and beating ourselves off when we go off course or we didn't understand something, we take personal responsibility and we look at the virtue that was missing and we do it differently moving forward. So we can ask ourselves, what lessons do we need to be learning at this time in our work in terms of cultural competence? Third strategy, setting clear boundaries based on restorative justice. So what are the boundaries that we have? What boundaries do we need? And instead of just punishing, it's asking, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? Who have you harmed and in what way? What virtue would have been helpful? and how can we make amends? How can we make things right to bring everybody back into community? So when there's been a mistake, that the person realizes that they made a mistake, not that they are a mistake. What boundaries do we have? What boundaries do we need? The fourth strategy is about honoring the spirit. You know, what brings people joy, meaning, and purpose? How do we honor our own spirit, that of our family, of our colleagues in the workplace? And then the last strategy is the companioning process. It's a 7-step counseling technique to lead somebody to their own solution. So it's how well do we listen to others, to ourselves, and what really needs to be heard? And given Dr. Bailey, what you shared, I'm going to add a fourth question. Who does it really need to be heard from? So those are the 5 strategies of the Virtues Project. And now the empathy card. As Dave reads, think about how this resonates with you.
Right. So I just want to give everybody a little bit of a visual. No, we're not going to get a visual on this.
You got to pull it back close to us, baby.
Yeah,
or maybe not. We'll put it in the chat box.
Welcome to Zoom. So this is the empathy card. And empathy is the ability to put ourselves in another's place and to understand their experience. We are deeply present to their thoughts and feelings with such compassionate accuracy that they can hear their own thoughts more clearly. Empathy connects us with our common humanity. It protects us from prejudice, blame, and judgment, those things that divide us from each other. With empathy, we reflect on how our actions affect others. It moves us to seek justice for every person, even those with whom we disagree. Empathy inspires us to be giving and selfless. Empathy connects our hearts. And then you can double tap the card. There's a quote and there's practices. Do you want to read those?
Sure.
Yeah. If everyone's okay, just reading that. I don't know what their timing is, but.
Yes, keep going. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience. So the quote on the back from Douglas Steer: to listen another soul into a condition of disclosure and discovery may be almost the greatest service any human being ever performs for another. The practice of empathy. So you can self-check. Here we go. I seek to understand others' experiences. I listen with compassion. I refrain from judging and blaming. I think about how my choices impact others. I care about people's rights. I feel my connection to all people. I am thankful for the gift of empathy. It sensitizes my heart. And for me, this is kind of what we've been talking about our whole time together. And I wonder in the chat box how it resonates with you. And we'll turn the talking piece back over to y'all.
Yeah, so often it's just, that's an opportunity to get people to share, and that's a connection tool. And it's just, if I can round up, and it's all about relationships. So even talking about empathy sometimes brings people together and talking about things, talking about what's humility look like, how does it show up in your life, so different ways. So I think a lot of how the workplace is to have these important conversations with each other and create the conditions for that, because a lot of times what's unsaid is often what harms us the most.
Good wisdom and discernment, baby.
So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for sharing that activity with us. And I see you posted the link in the chat. In the meantime, I would like to go back to a question that we got earlier on from Christoph. Let's see. I work for a higher education association. A number of presidents, provosts, and diversity officers I have talked with more recently have emphasized wanting to move into a period of intentionality 2.0. Do you agree that there is an urgency for meaningful and practical change? If so, what can Maryland and other colleges and universities do to help them along the path? Anyone can answer.
So really quickly, I think moving to a restorative campus, so utilizing restorative practices and restorative justice, and moving away from punitive and colonization.
I'll add to that. I think that's a great idea. I think also something that came up in our conversations is like, and also I shows up in the book, is that that it's intention and impact need to come together. So like a lot of us say, we assume positive intent, but that can actually create a lot of harm in the world. And so what we need to do is also own the impact. So I believe that there is importance for practical change, but I hear intentionality 2.0. And I think intentionality 2.0 is being like, okay, we might have positive intent, but that at the end of the day, we have to own the impact that our words and our actions have. And if it's a negative impact, we need to own that and say, you know what, I messed up, and it's a learning, it's a teaching moment for me, and apologize and have that restorative justice framework that you were talking about. But also if it's something, we have a responsibility to, like, for us as individuals to step into those roles and to be part of that change. Like I remember Dr. Bailey was mentioning earlier, it's like, we have to step into those roles. That's kind of where we're going. The younger generations are there, but we have a responsibility as we get closer, for everybody across the board. So it's not just something where we just have intention, we have to have impact as well, positive impact.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and I've been kind of sitting with it and thinking about it in terms of especially the group in which you're working with. And my first kind of gut reaction was the urgency's always been there, particularly for me as a Black trans person. The urgency has always been, so when I think about people feeling that urgency now, I'm like, is it because of more visibility in the news? Is it because people's awareness is or companies are being required to talk about anti-racism now and anti-Blackness? Sure. But what I will say is that the urgency that you all might be feeling is probably just a millimeter or just a small smidge of what people who are in multiple marginalized identities have been feeling their whole lives. And so for me, the urgency is been yesterday, in terms of going about change and centering our most vulnerable people, and figuring out action plans from there. I also believe that there's a lot of power that can happen when we address intergenerational disconnection and intergenerational trauma, particularly that happens in higher education. I sometimes feel like some of the reasons why we're not moving as quickly as we can is because we have very different understandings in terms of generations around what this work looks like. Right? Is it multiculturalism or is it social justice? Is it social justice or is it intersectionality? Is it intersectionality or is it anti-racism? Right? And all of these different frameworks coming into play and people having different language. But there's a lot of power when we began to have these conversations intergenerationally and actually allow particularly young people, folks who are millennials, who are speaking truth to power around their identities, to listen to those folks. And so, if not, in terms of higher education, we will not retain them. Millennials are already leaving, and so I think that, if we want to retain talent and we want to really be about liberatory practices and justice, then we have to come from the place of urgency, because people have been already feeling that urgency for decades and centuries, depending upon where your identities fall in terms of intersectionality.
Thank you. In the interest of time, it's 10:58. I want to make sure that all of our panelists have a chance to leave us with some parting words, some closing remarks, something to reflect on. I'm going to start with Dave and Dara.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a joy and an honor. So I think at the end of the day, this work is personal. Let's make friends with ourselves, make friends with one another. And if you step on somebody's toe, you don't say you didn't do it. You say, hey, I'm sorry, and take responsibility.
Yeah, and building on what Dara was saying, I think, conversations are critical at this stage. it's a different time than it was, and we're all trying to learn how to communicate better. The world is very complicated right now. Dr. Bailey was just talking about, all of the different terminologies that we have and understanding even just the languages themselves. So it really is important to listen and to share, and it's about your mindset. I agree with what Amy was saying about intentionality, but in some ways, having the right intent and saying, I want to know who you are and how I can support you is really important. So I think that the conversations are important, and weaves back in empathy and some of those other virtues we talked about, compassion and dignity and nobility, are off the center.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I would offer that as an extension of what Dara and Dave was just sharing, is that I think it starts with us, right? As individuals, like, we have to do our own cultural competency to understand what are our biases, what are our mindsets around different groups of people, and how can I improve myself? Because the system will not change unless we change ourselves. So I want to just offer that.
And Dr. Van Bailey.
Yeah, I would just say that, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. If it makes you uncomfortable, that is giving you really good information. No change can occur without discomfort. No change or learning can occur without discomfort. So being able to lean into that discomfort is really where their transformation happens.
Once again, I want to thank all of you panelists for joining us today. Amy, Dave, Dara, and Van, for sharing your expertise, guidance, and advice with us. Thank you all for being here this morning. That includes all of our alumni that signed in. We hope you will join us again at 12 noon for a session highlighting the experiences and lessons learned from alumni who started businesses while they were students at Maryland, and at 2 p.m. for a roundtable discussion led by University of Maryland's Chief Innovation Officer, Julie Linzer. Once again, enjoy the rest of your day and go Terps.